want to talk about the difference in values between the pagans, the pagans, the pagans, the pagans, the pagans, the pagans and the Christians, and their different take on scientific values. So scientific values determine whether science is going to progress or not, because you have to adopt these values. Now, there are fundamental three values. One is curiosity. Do you value curiosity? Do you think it's worthwhile? Not only is it a positive good to be curious about the nature of the world or ask questions and stuff, but is it something, a positive, useful thing for you to do to actually pursue your curiosity? The Christians did not like curiosity, because curiosity, you're asking questions, you're asking too many questions. Like, we don't like you asking too many questions. And why should you be so curious about the nature of creation? If God wanted you to know, He would have told you. And so we actually literally have some Christians who actually say these things. That, if whatever God wanted you to know, He would have told you. If he didn't tell you, He didn't want you to know, so why are you researching it? So this is a very anti-curiosity point of view. I really don't like this.
Just talk about it.
Yes, I am good at that. So the Christians were anti-curiosity in that respect. The pagans were very pro-curiosity. In fact, they would even write treatises saying, like, don't be curious about gossip and your neighbors and stuff. If you're curious, explore nature. Do a search and understand the nature of the world, the nature of humanity, and all this stuff. So they actually promoted curiosity as a scientific value. So that actually drove scientific progress throughout the Greek world and the Roman world after it. When the Christians took over, they're like, we don't like this curiosity thing. And that kind of put a damper on science, actually kind of one of the three things that stalled it for 1,000 years. But the other thing is empiricism, this idea that facts and evidence trump all authority. And that's the Greeks really came up with that idea. The Romans liked it too and kept it. The Christians didn't like this, because if evidence can trump authority, that means that you can trump a pope or a bishop or a priest or a scripture or the revelation of Jesus. You can't trump those things with evidence, and we can't have that. So they're very not very big on the whole empiricism thing. And then the other aspect of it is progress. You have to believe not only that progress in understanding the natural world is possible, you can actually keep understanding more and more about the world. You also have to believe that it's valuable and it's worth doing that. And the Christians were not in favor of this. The Christians thought that that in fact science was just a bunch of human opinions. They're all squabbling. Everybody disagrees with each other. It's very much like climate science. So like, well, you have these different scientists. They disagree with each other, so we're just going to say there's no real scientific knowledge there. The Christians did that with all science. They said, well, you pick any like random dude who's going to contradict some scientist and say, look, all these educated intellectuals, they don't agree. So there is no true scientific knowledge. It's just human opinion. There's no progress in knowledge. We're just not going to do that. So there's very different attitudes. So when the Christian attitudes took over, they did not run with science as far as it had gotten. They didn't run with it any further. And it took 1,000 years for a few radical Christians to actually notice the pagan values and say, hey, these are kind of cool values. And they started trying to promote them, try to re-paganize Christianity. That's not how they sold it. They sold it as, these are good Christian values, trust us. But in reality, they were trying to reintegrate these old pagan values back into Christianity. And that led to the scientific revolution. So that's a key part of this narrative. But let's talk about the actual achievements. So science really, there's two beginning points. One is the first person, who's Thales, we're talking 6th century BC. Thales is the first person we know in history who actually decided to look at nature and say, I'm going to explain everything that we see in terms of cause and effect, rather than gods or spirits or magic or any of that stuff. Let's try to understand it as a system of causes and effects. And one of the famous examples is that he figured, like, okay, so why is the moon lit up? And then he sort of figured it out geometrically. He's like, actually, it's the sun's light is reflecting off the moon. And that explains the phases of the moon. That explains, it also explains lunar eclipses. It's a shadow of the Earth on the moon. And it explains solar eclipses. The moon is just moving in front of the sun. And this was one of like the biggest leaps in understanding, is like we can explain all this natural phenomena if we just look at it geometrically and empirically as just cause and effect. Things are affecting each other. It's not resorting to the supernatural. And so he's like the first one to do that. And also what he did is he started this inquiry into method. He's saying, like, how do we know things? What is a good, reliable way to figure stuff out? What are bad ways to figure stuff out? What is the best way to know that you know what you know, essentially? And so asking those two questions actually drove this interest in science. So that started the germ of the idea of it, and there are various other philosophers who are going with this. But then Aristotle comes along, and Aristotle really systematizes it and says, let's make a system out of this, let's make a procedure out of this, let's try to apply science to everything and understand it. And everybody makes fun now of Aristotle for his physics. He got physics wrong. But Aristotle was a biologist. He was a really good biologist. He did dissections of animals. He dissected chicken eggs at different stages of gestation to watch the development of the fetus. He did vivisection, where he would take a chameleon that was alive and dissect it while it was still alive to see how its parts worked. So he's doing like really good biology. But he's a biologist, so yeah, he sucked at physics, but you could say that of probably a lot of biologists. But anyway, he started this idea, like actually you could like get dirty experimenting and like looking at stuff and learn things. And so after him, then science exploded. A lot of other scientists are doing things that he was doing, but expanding beyond him. And I'll give you an example. Aristotle, of course, famously theorized that the brain is just a cooling organ, and that all thought and everything happened in the heart. Within about 100 years of him saying that, we had Herophilus and Erasistratus, these two medical scientists in Alexandria, Egypt, started dissecting human cadavers and doing vivisection experiments on animals, and not only figured out, they mapped all the motor and sensory nerves, so they were able to distinguish between motor and sensory nerves. They mapped them all throughout the body, figured out they all go to the brain, not the heart, and that led them to realize, actually, it's the brain is the thinking organ, the heart's not, has nothing to do with it. And then they were doing vivisection experiments on animals and localizing brain function. So saying, well, if we cut this part out, it can't see anymore. If we cut this part out, the left arm doesn't work anymore. If we cut this part out, it can't hear anymore. So they actually not only knew that the brain at that point was the center of thought, but they knew that there's different parts of the brain did different things, and they were actually anatomically identifying those different sections of the brain.
What year was that?
That would have been about 250 BC. And so that's in anatomy, so anatomy and physiology, and it kept going after that. So there's a lot of other scientists doing things related to that all the way up to about 250 AD. And the last great medical scientist who's doing these kinds of experiments was Galen. So he lived about 180 to 230 AD. Last great Roman scientist in the life sciences. And he did a lot of really fantastic stuff in terms of anatomy and physiology. He got the circulatory system wrong, but he was an expert in the renal system and figured out lots of stuff about what the kidneys do and what their function was and things like that. Now, there were two tracks that they're really good at. One was life sciences when they're applied to medicine, and the other is engineering. So physics when it was applicable. So they got those two things pretty well done. But they also were doing some good stuff in astronomy, even when it wasn't necessarily applicable to any actual real-world example. So I'll give you an example of that. Aristarchus, famously around 300 BC, Aristarchus posited heliocentric theory. So it's the first time saying, actually, we could explain the motion of the planets better if they all go around the sun. And then he was a tutor of Seleucus. So his pupil, Seleucus, went on to actually study that and actually also study the tides. He's trying to explain why do the tides rise and fall the way they do, this weird pattern. And Seleucus figured out that it was both the position of the moon and the position of the sun that combined to determine the height of the tides. And so he actually proposed that there was some sort of force being projected by the moon and the sun that sucked up the water as they were approaching or disappearing and so on. So they were very, very close to universal gravitation. They had this idea of that anyway. But they have figured out lunisolar tide theory. It's an example. They're watching things, they're taking records, they're comparing data and getting results. In physics, there's a lot of things like this going on. The most famous example, I'll start with Eratosthenes, where we have an overlap between astronomy, physics, and geology, or geography. Eratosthenes actually figured out the size of the Earth. Now, by the time of Aristotle, the scientific evidence that the Earth was a sphere was already pretty solid. They had numerous corroborating evidences, tons of them. I don't have time to go through them all, but there are a lot of them. They really had a solid idea that the Earth is definitely a sphere. So it's a sphere, how big is it? That's an interesting question. Eratosthenes figured, well, if it's a sphere, we can do some geometry. And one thing that Eratosthenes learned is that there was a place in Egypt where at noon on a certain day, there was no shadow cast by a stick. So if you have a stick straight up and down, or a well that's dug into the ground, the sun goes straight down. Basically, there's no shadow being cast. But the same time of day, the same day, you could be 500 miles north in a different city, and there's a stick also pointing straight up and down, and yet it casts a shadow. And he looked at that and he measured the difference, so you could measure the size of that shadow. Do some geometry, you can actually figure out the size of the circle you're sitting on. And he was right, it's about 10%. He was accurate for the size of the Earth, about 10%. So doing that kind of stuff. And then we get to physics. So we have Archimedes, most famously. Archimedes did various things. The first mathematical law of physics was the law of the lever. Basically, why a certain amount of pressure with a certain amount of distance results in a certain amount of strength on the other end. The actual mathematically work it out exactly how the lever worked. We don't know who invented that or who discovered that. It was sometime between Aristotle and Archimedes. But by the time of Archimedes, he's describing this law of physics and understands the physics of it. But he's also figuring out something else, which is the law of buoyancy and equilibrium. And he figured out that if you put an object in water, it weighs less. And sometimes it weighs so much less that it floats. And he actually worked out a mathematical theorem that explained exactly how much less it would weigh and why it would weigh that much less, or how high it would float, and so on. And to do this, he invented the basic principle of specific density. So he used water as the basic value. So this basic value of density 1 is 1 unit of water volume. So the density of water in that volume is 1. We still use that measure today. So that's our base value for specific density for measuring density of objects. We use water as the basis. It's because Archimedes, he started. So he's doing a bunch of really cool stuff in physics that way. And other things are happening. We know various philosophers and scientists were working on laws of reflection, so mathematical laws of why objects reflect a certain way, and laws of refraction. So they knew that light bent in water, they knew light bent in glass, and they're working that out. The last great Roman physicist, the last great physicist of the ancient world was Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century AD. Ptolemy was an astronomer. He's the one who built the most famous geocentric theory that everybody talks about. I'll get more on that, but he was also, we know, towards the end of his life, working on studying refraction, and he invented the index of refraction. So different materials refract light in different ways, and he developed that actual index of refraction that we still use today for how much light, or how much glass refracts, how much water refracts, what happens when you have an interface of glass and water, or glass and air, or water and air, and so on. So he's doing that, but he's also, we know, working on convex and concave lenses. So he's actually studying the refraction properties of lenses. So he's really close to getting to telescopes and things like that, but they didn't get there quite yet. The world collapsed before that happened, basically. So this is just an example of the kind of stuff that was going on. And they knew things, and they knew how to apply this knowledge. So, for example, they knew the Earth was a sphere. Eratosthenes measured it. We know it's about, he knows it was some size, relatively close. We know now that it was about 10% off. So they knew it was a sphere. Now, if you're running the Roman Empire, you have an empire so large that it spans a large part of this curved surface. And if you're going to map it, how do you map a curved surface with flat maps? And so Ptolemy and his predecessor actually developed cartographic projection. Several different systems of cartographic projection where they could actually map curved surfaces on flat surfaces. And Ptolemy was aware that the measurements that had been made of the size of the Earth were not terribly accurate. So we don't really have a super accurate measurement of the diameter of the Earth, but what we do have is we can take really accurate astronomical observations and determine where we are on the planet in reference to astronomical objects. And so he invented the entire system of latitude and longitude. So this idea of us describing where we are on the planet in terms of degrees rather than miles, so like degrees west, degrees north, and all of that stuff, he invented that specifically to solve the problem that we didn't know how much a degree was. And he says in there, like, when we get an accurate measurement of the size of the Earth, then you'll know how much miles represents a degree, then you just plug it all in and you've got it to go. Meanwhile, we'll do everything in degrees because we can get more accurate measurements that way. So this whole system of latitude and longitude was invented by Ptolemy to map the Roman Empire. And of course, he put the Greenwich line at Alexandria. When the British took over the world, they decided to move it to London. So, but we use that system now. But originally, that line was Alexandria, Egypt. It got moved by white imperialists. But anyway, but originally, that's what he invented that for that particular purpose. Now, so I'll talk a little bit more about that because everybody makes fun of Ptolemy for being a geocentrist. He really argues against heliocentrism. But all his arguments, none of them are theological. They were not religious. It had nothing to do with being the center of the universe, all that. It was all physics. He did not know yet, for example, I mean, he thought like if the Earth was spinning so fast, like there'd be torrential winds scraping across it, and that's not happening. Or if you shoot an arrow, it would go off course if you're shooting in a different direction, and all these things. Which makes sense until you understand basic Galilean relativity, where you have momentum and all of that stuff. But they hadn't figured that out yet. So his reasons were principled. They're based on the data at the time. And he develops this system, and people make fun of him for noticing that perfect circles don't work. So he has offset circles, so that things orbit around the Earth, but they're offset. The Earth is not at the center. They call it an X-center, so the Earth is at the X-center. And also, not only do they orbit around, but they actually change their velocity. And also they orbit in tiny circles as they go around, really slowly. So you have circles on circles. So this epicycles theory. People make fun of this. It's like epicycles on epicycles. But actually, Ptolemy says in his treatises that actually when you look at it mathematically, the epicycles on cycles, the idea of circles on circles, only describes a single continuous motion. And the reason he's using circles upon circles is because you can make a machine that does that. He's trying to describe, and he actually explicitly talks about cutting gears that would actually represent these motions. So the actual motions he's describing are non-constant velocities near elliptical orbits. But he's using combined circular motion to recreate it in a machine. And we actually recovered one of these machines, not one of the ones that were as advanced as the ones he was designing and building, but previous to him, about a few hundred years, we have one actually, so about 120 BC, someone was building a primitive version of one of these machines, and it's actually a dial readout computer, a gear-based computer. And you can find photos of it online. It's called the Antikythera mechanism, or the Antikythera computer. And in 120 it was built about 88 BC. There was a Roman ship. Romans had looted some city in Greece that they'd sacked, and they'd filled it with treasure, and the ship sank off the island of Antikythera, hence the name of it. And in 1910, some sponge divers went down and found it. Not only did they find these amazing treasures in there, and the coin evidence, which allows us to date when the ship sank, but they also found this weird machine that was all smashed up and rusted up. So a bunch of pieces. They brought them back up, and since then we've done a lot of research on it. We've done computerized actual tomography on the components, and scientists and historians have gotten together and reconstructed one. And actually this is what it did. It was a machine with a whole system, complex system of gears in it. It had one knob, and the instruction manual was written on the outside. You turn the knob, you could pick any date from the day the machine was made to 250 years in the future of that date. And you pick a day, and it would tell you what day it was in 4 different calendars, so it would reconcile 4 different calendrical systems. It would tell you what sign of the zodiac the sun will rise in, accurately, incidentally. It would tell you what sign of the zodiac each of the 5 known planets would be in. It would tell you what phase the moon was in, and it would tell you whether a lunar or solar eclipse was possible on that date or impossible on that date. All just by turning a dial, picking a day, it would tell you all that information. So the first computers were actually invented by the ancient Greeks, and they were getting more and more sophisticated over time. We have descriptions, literary descriptions, of more advanced versions of these computers that existed, but all the others are lost. We just got lucky and found one smashed up at the bottom of the sea because of this one shipwreck. So this is what they're doing. And so when Ptolemy's talking about building a machine to replicate the motions of the planets, and he's using combined circular motion, he's not imagining necessarily that there's actually circles on circles. He's just saying, if you're going to build a machine to replicate this, this is what you got to do. But the actual combined motion looks more like an ellipse, and it's in constant velocities. And he developed the first law of planetary motion, which was equal angles and equal times. So based on the center or eccentre, equal angles and equal times would predict the velocity of the planets. Now, Kepler later realized that it's an ellipse, not a circle, and he did equal areas and equal times. The most famous planetary law, equal areas and equal times, just defines even more accurately the motion of the planets in a heliocentric system. But in a geocentric system, you could do equal angles and equal times. It works just as well. Anyway, so that's an example of the kind of science that's going on in ancient Rome. And I'll give you, before I stop and open it up to Q&A, because I'm sure there's many angles we could explore on this, because my book, which comes out in December, is 700 pages long, so there's like tons of stuff in there. Cool stories, full, thorough discussion of all the different sciences and where they went, which sciences they didn't develop very well, which ones they did. But to give you some examples, like random off the top of my head, they were using electroshock therapy. They would use electric eels to cure or treat hemorrhoids, for example, if you can imagine this. Yes. and as local anesthetic.
Why we have to speak after.
So you could electrocute someone with an electric eel. That spot of their body would be non-sensitive to pain, and then you could work on it. But they're also working on things. There was a medical scientist, Archigenes, in the early Roman Empire, 1st century AD. He wrote a treatise. Now, almost all this stuff was lost, by the way. Like 99% of ancient science was lost. We only have a few treatises. Some only survive in Arabic, and some we only know of by report. So we have other texts that references them or quote them. So we know about tons of treatises that existed, but they're almost all lost. This is one of them. So Archigenes wrote a treatise where he actually used dogs as proxies for animals, or proxies for humans, and used hellebore and basically tested doses to see how much would kill them, how much would knock them out, how much they had no effect, so that you could figure out the amount of dose by weight to give a surgery patient that would knock them out, so you could have them safely undergo surgery without pain. So we had this whole treatise where he's undergoing like controlled experiments with figuring out, it's animal experimentation, but they did a lot of that back then. Just gives you just an example. Those are just two examples of many other things that were going on in the ancient world in terms of ancient science. And I do write about all of that and how much they praised and advocated those three scientific values I was talking about. Plus, I have a chapter on quoting all the Christians of the time, ragging on all of it. They didn't like any of this stuff. So if you want to see all of that, that's going to be in that book, which will come out in December. And it's available for pre-order on Amazon, but if you're interested in that. So that's just a really brief précis of everything, and I would love to open up the questions and then see where we go from there.
Yeah. A lot of knowledge was lost when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed.
We don't know what happened to that. So most of the stories of its destruction are bogus. The only one that comes close to being plausible is under the Muslims. So we actually have evidence that it was still around all the way up to the beginning of the 7th century. We have inscriptions and papyri of librarians of the Library of Alexandria and stuff. So it was still a thing for a good long time. So then it disappears after the 7th century. And so we do have legends that say that when the Muslims invaded Alexandria, they wrote a letter to Caliph Omar and said, so we got this huge library, what do we do with it? And he wrote a letter back and said, well, yeah, you got all those books, but if they agree with the Quran, we don't need them. If they disagree, they ought to be burned, so just burn them all. And then they didn't burn the library, they took the books out and used them as fuel for the baths, to heat the baths of the city. Now that's the story. It's disputed as to whether that's true or false. I think it's the most plausible account of what actually happened. And this was, it was the Muslims. And this was before the Muslims got really excited by science, right? So like 200 years later, of course, if you're running a massive Islamic empire, you need intellectuals and smart people, and of course, intellectuals and smart people kind of are into science. And so then they started reading all this Greek stuff, and they're like, this is amazing. And so then the whole sort of renaissance of Islamic science started then, but it was too late by that point. The library is long gone. Now, however, having said that, if the library was destroyed in the 7th century AD, it was under Christian custody for 300 years. Your average book lasts 100 years, 200 at most. So in reality, the library might have had a bunch of Christian bullshit in it by then. It might have already...
No law.
Yeah, so we don't really know. We don't really know, is the point being.
That's what we're...
Well, I don't know, because there might have been a lot of cool shit about Christian history that we could have gotten out of there. But the point being is that... And also the economy had been tanking for 300 years, so the state in which the library was in might have been really shitty by then anyway. So I don't think it was like the great... It was more of a slow decline. Right, yeah. It wasn't this great, fabulous library that was suddenly instantly burned. If you want to know about libraries, we actually have one. Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, destroyed Pompeii with pyroclastic flow, but Herculaneum was a little bit further. It got buried under asphalt, slow asphalt. And there was a rich man's villa there, and he had a big library with a Greek section and a Latin section. And we have evidence that they were trying to evacuate the library's books, but gave up and ran off. And in the 19th century, they excavated as far as the staging area, where they apparently had the wagons where they were trying to load the books on. So we didn't even get into the library yet. We just got to the staging area and recovered some scrolls, and they were like charcoal, but they broke them up and, by human eye and magnifying glass trying to figure out the text. And so we recovered a few texts. But they realized this was massively destructive and time-consuming and expensive, and they knew there's a whole other library in there to go on. They didn't have the money for it, so they reburied it. And then, of course, Italy's economy's been in the shitter ever since, so they've never had the money to go back. So it's still sitting there. We have a complete library, 79 AD. All of its books are there. We just have to go in and dig it up. Now, I'll tell you another interesting story. Archimedes, I told you about Archimedes, right, scientist. In the Middle Ages, all his treatises have been destroyed or lost, and there were only 2 left. We know of 2 manuscripts that existed. One disappeared, we don't know what happened to it. The other, in the 14th century or 15th century, was in the East, and these Christian monks scraped the ink off with pumice stone and wrote hymns to God over it. And then someone found this later, and this is called a palimpsest, by the way. We have lots of these, where they scrape the ink off and there's ink underneath, and we can recover the lost if we look at it really carefully and can see what was really originally there. We have lots of these types of texts. There's a Quran that has this interesting thing, that has the original Quran text and then the modern text is written on top of it. But that's a whole other debate. But anyway, so we have a lot of these. But this one, they were having difficulty reconstructing the text accurately. And it's literally the only surviving text of the works of Archimedes, any of the works of Archimedes, not even all of his works, just a sample of them. And eventually someone had the idea, why don't we take that and put it in a particle accelerator at Stanford University, and we'll use the cloud chamber computer to calculate the position of all the iron atoms in the book, and we'll have the computer subtract the ink we can see, and what we'll have left is the ink that was originally there. And they literally use that to reconstruct the works of Archimedes. Yeah, so there's books on this. It's a fantastic story. So here's my elevator speech for Elon Musk, or Bill Gates or whatever. Is that it starts with an ancient library that's buried in Herculaneum, and it ends with particle accelerators and the recovery of an entire ancient library. So we can put those scrolls in there. We don't have to break them up. We put them in there and have the computer unroll it. Just run a sim of the scroll and unroll it digitally, right? We have that ability, so we just need the money. We probably need $100 million or something. So someone's got to invest the money. So it's there. I just want to see it done. I don't even have to be involved. I just want to read the books that result.
If somebody could defund the wall, I think.
Well, that's the thing is like that. What would be more prestigious to have your name attached to for all history is the guy who recovered an entire lost ancient library, or the guy who built a frickin' wall that separated 2 nations, right? So anyway,
In Donald Trump's mind, or in some sane mind?
granted, fair point.
Yeah.
You had a question.
Didn't I read recently that they have found another method to read an ancient world scroll without having to open it, like X-rays or?
Yeah, it's computerized axial tomography.
Yeah.
So, now that might not work with a charred scroll, but it might work with an intact scroll. So I don't really know actually. So you'd have to talk to someone who's actually done it and see how good an image do you get. But computerized axial tomography, which is CAT scanning, is basically it's a 3D X-ray. So they take an X-ray from multiple angles and use a computer to take the X-ray information and reconstruct what's there. And we use it to look at bones and things like that. But you can do it because the ink reacts differently to X-rays than the paper or papyrus, as the case may be. And so you can do that. If you had an intact scroll, it would be easy to do axial tomography on it. Now, if it's a charred scroll, I'm not so sure, but that would make it even easier. You wouldn't even need a particle accelerator, right? So, yes, we have that technology, and that same tech was used on the Antikythera device as well.
Right.
So we made the 3D computer models of what was inside the rusted hunks of metal.
And they've made reproductions of it.
Yeah, I have.
Constructed it.
I didn't, since there weren't slides. I was just giving a talk off the top of my head. I have pictures, by the way. So here, this is the most realistic reconstruction. I know it's small for all y'all, but showing you the front and back, you see the dial readouts. That's a pretty accurate reproduction. It looked pretty much like this originally. Maybe the thing it's missing is that it had the instruction manual written on the outside of it, inscribed in Greek, which we actually can see pieces of. And this is clean, so you don't see any of the Greek on it, but it had Greek letters written all over it, explaining to you how to use the device. Let's see what else we got here. Pieces of it. So here's an example of one of the dial readouts. I'm going to walk you through it all. So this is a map that shows Antikythera in relation to Greece in general. So it was found off an island there. And here's chunks of it at the Athens Museum. They're still on display. We show the drive wheel. You can see some of the dial readouts here. Here's a close-up of the drive wheel. And then here you can see, if you look really closely, I know it's tough, but you can see the hash marked dial readout. That's one of the main readout parts of the device. If you look even closer, I know it's all modeled and crappy, but there is Greek letters in there, Greek text written on it. And then this shows, yeah, this doesn't show well at all. No, I can't grow it up. And that's about the best I can do. But it's the gearing is all meshed together, frozen together from patina rust over time. But it really intricate gearing in the device. So yeah, I have, like I said, I've got pictures of that. You can find more on the internet. There's tons, super popular. I mean, when you find out there's an actual freaking computer from 88 BC, the internet goes wild. So there's like tons of that stuff available. Usually you would hear that and you go, that has to be fake. So most shit on the internet is fake. I can vouch for the fact this is real. and it's actual, yeah.
So in early times, is there any notion of intrinsic randomness in nature, or for them was it always a fully deterministic universe?
That was debated. So they had different philosophical schools that debated both of those questions. Is there randomness? Is it deterministic? Most actual scientists who were doing the most progress in science were determinists, but there were some who were randomists, essentially. The Epicureans and the atomists proposed the idea that there was sometimes atoms randomly go a different direction than they're meant to. It's kind of very anticipating quantum mechanics in a way, but and that this makes things not be deterministic. But most scientists were like, yeah, it's deterministic, but we want to understand how it works. So yeah, it was usually determinism. And they understood things like Brownian motion and loose concepts of like how randomization could be an output of determinism that's still deterministic. So they were doing things like that.
These ancient arguments about God being the primary mover
Right.
sort of relies on a deterministic causality that's always going on, and there's an initial cause.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
quantum random fluctuations is not going to work.
Exactly, and you've really hit on an important division in the ancient world. The randomists were not big on the godism thing. So the atomists were, gods are just aliens that live on other planets and don't care about us. They were not creators of the universe. So the Epicureans and their progeny and ancestors in relation to people with similar doctrines didn't think the gods were responsible for anything. But there might have been gods, but whatever, they're irrelevant. But the determinists were usually very goddessy. And so they thought there was a fundamental God who's setting it all in motion. And then you get these different interesting theologies that result from that. But yeah, and this was again a division and debate among scientists. And there was a recognition that it might not be known for sure which is correct.
So determinism plus omniscience means that we don't have free will.
Well, it depends on how you define free will. And they were having that debate too, although not quite at the level we are today. But yes, they were compatible. Aristotle was kind of a compatibilist, essentially. He thought that free will has more to do with whether you have autonomy in relation to the external world and people interfering with you, not the question of whether you have complete separation from causal forces. But there's debate over that because Aristotle is vague on this, and most of the writings that were done on this after have been lost. And we only have some quotations. So like we have Stoics that were after Aristotle talking about different models of compatibilism and determinism, but we only have some scattered quotations. The actual treatises have been lost, so we don't really know where they were going with it. But there is clearly debate as to how you define free will, what do you mean by it, and how is it compatible with determinism or is it not? And so that debate was going on in the ancient world as well. Any other questions? Yeah.
The library at Alexandria, what was the purpose behind creating it?
Well, we're not entirely sure, right? So a lot of the writings that were originally written about it were lost. So we only have like maybe 3 or 4 times removed references to what was going on. Now, it began as a prestige thing, it seems. So what happened is Alexander the Great conquered everything and then up and died suddenly. And so all his generals then decided wherever they happened to have their armies, said, well, this is mine now. And then the whole world got carved up by where they happened to have the generals, where they happened to have armies. One of which was Egypt. And that was Ptolemy. So Ptolemy took Egypt. This is now mine. And the city of Alexandria, which was named after Alexander, was founded by Alexander, was built up by that point. And they're all competing. These kings are competing for prestige and to show how awesome they are. And one of the ways to do this is to conspicuous consumption on things that are valued by people who you want to impress. one of which is knowledge at this time. So showing that you had the greatest library, and you had the greatest schools, and you had the greatest scientists, and you had like the greatest geographers and all of this stuff. It's like, we're the best. Don't fuck with us. It's kind of like that, the idea of that. And then, of course, they were using these scientists to build military technology as well. So they were doing scientific experiments on catapult technology to improve it. They invented like automatic catapults and air-powered catapults and all. They were experimenting with all kinds of things. It turns out that those things were not very useful on the battlefield, but they did greatly improve catapult technology in ways that are really remarkable. Like they were like half the power of guns, low-powered guns. So they were like getting really damn good at these, and being able to like use scientific laws of scaling laws to scale them up, all the way from like house-sized catapults that could shoot like gigantic rocks, down to literally handheld, like handgun versions. And they were torsion-powered. So if you know torsion is this twisted rope. So like a bow, all the torsion is in the bow, so you're bending the bow and all the energy is in that. But the torsion you can twist and twist and twist and twist and twist. You can have a vast amount of energy in there. And so you just have these cylinders, and then you have the sticks that hold it, and the cylinders are like massively torqued up to hell. And then you have the power generated from that. So the torsion catapult they invented. Now it's a really difficult, sophisticated device to make. So that was the thing, they were developing these. They were developing new ship and warship technologies as well. They built some of the largest war galleys in history before modern times. So they're doing all of that, but I think it was mostly prestige, right? So like we have the greatest library. Ptolemy instituted a law, according to legend, or at least according to the records we have, that any ship that ported at Alexandria would be searched by library professionals. They'd go in and search it, and any books they found, go to the library, they would copy them, and you had to wait for them to be copied before you could get them back. So you could theoretically get your books back, but any books that ever touched the harbor, they would get copies in the library. So they're really caring about building this to be the biggest damn library ever, so they could boast of it being the biggest damn library ever. And I remember Eratosthenes, I mentioned, he was trained and working at Alexandria. Archimedes had friends. Archimedes and Eratosthenes were buds. They wrote letters. Archimedes may have trained in Alexandria, but he was based in Sicily. But there are other famous people. Euclid's out of Alexandria. You can name a lot of famous scientists out of Alexandria. So that it was prestige, probably the main reason.
But it was then a research center for them.
It became very much that, and stayed that way for a long time. I mean, there was a dip in the late second, early first century BC, where there were like crazy rulers of Egypt, and there was lots of wars everywhere, and there's a lot of neglect of the intellectual side of things. But Cleopatra is actually famous for reviving that. Cleopatra started reinvesting in the library and intellectuals and stuff. She was very big on having intellectuals in her court. She was famously could speak like dozens of languages. She was the first Ptolemy of the whole line of Ptolemies going back. She was the last Ptolemy, but of all the Ptolemies, she was the first one that actually learned the language of the people she ruled. So she was famously the only person who actually talked to her own citizens. And she would have like dinner parties and things, and she would invite and try to encourage medical research again in Alexandria, and so that Archigenes and some of these other research projects that are going on at Alexandria are either under Cleopatra or are a result of the program she initiated. So she did really revive that, and when the Roman emperors took over after her death, they liked it too, so they kept it going, and so they were. It was not as central a focus of them as it had been for the previous rulers of Egypt, but they did keep it going. They kept it running. And for example, when Domitian, 90 AD, and somewhere in the 90s AD, the Library of Rome burned down, and Domitian wanted to replace it, so he had to send scholars to Alexandria to get copies of all that was there. So Alexandria Library was still kind of like the fundamental, the library you go to for that. So yeah, it kept going for a while. And then when there's the political and economic collapse going on after that, I'm sure it fell into neglect and decline. And then you had the famous burning of Serapeum, which was the Annex Library. That was the Christians did that, by the way. Those of you who want to know about that story, there's a movie, a really good movie. It's super sad, you'll cry by the end of it, but it's a really good movie called Agora, and it's about Hypatia. So I give a talk on, I'll do a commentary on the historical accuracies of the movie. It's actually really good as fiction. You accept it they're making up a lot of stuff, they're filling in gaps, but in terms of portraying the reality of what was going on, it's a really good reconstruction of what could have happened, essentially. But that shows the destruction of Serapeum. But you notice that in the movie, it's written in that the Great Library had already been destroyed. And so supposedly by Caesar. That turns out to have been a manuscript error. That didn't really happen. But but that what's depicted in the destruction of Serapeum is authentic. And what it was is they didn't really care about the books. The Christians just didn't like the temple, didn't like the pagans inside it. So burning the books was just a bonus. It wasn't really their target per se. Destroying the Serapeum was a symbol of the top of the pagans. But yeah, so that is one thing. Sometimes the burning of the Serapeum, which is the Annex Library, and about a tenth of the books that were in the Great Library, those two get confused sometimes. So
This may be a dumb question, but why did people in the Roman Empire jump from pantheism to Christianity? They didn't go through Judaism. Like they didn't go through the God concept.
This is something I read about in On the Historicity of Jesus. They actually were going through henotheism. So they were going through their own model of henotheism. Judaism had a certain popularity, actually. Jews were actually recruiting. So you could actually convert to Judaism as long as you cut off a piece of your penis if you were a man and submitted to all the laws, which of course were even worse for women. So they were recruiting. So there was a certain popularity to this idea of this austerity and sort of brotherhood of Judaism. It's kind of like, it's the same way like people get really sucked into Scientology or something like that, or some sort of weird, extremely elaborate diet that they think really helps them out. People get sucked in that way. But all of paganism was really pushing and growing towards the henotheistic model, which is the idea that all the gods are actually just subordinates to one great supreme god, or they're different faces of that one god. So they're different manifestations of the one god. So they're really tying it all into a kind of proto-monotheism. And really the Jews were doing the same thing, because the Jews had God, but then they had Satan, who's kind of like a god, and then they have, and Paul literally calls it a god, it's just a subordinate, he's an inferior god. And then the angels. So all the angels have similar powers to the pagan gods, right? So they have angelology. They just don't call them gods. But pagans would look at the Jewish system and go, oh, it's just like us. Like, your angels are our gods, and you've got one supreme god, and we got that. So it's the same thing. And so there is a lot of similarities there. So when you look at it culturally, it makes much more sense. It's not a radical shift from like wild paganism to austere monotheism. All of these threads are already going. So the attraction to austerity, the attraction to asceticism was already in paganism happening. The henotheism was already going on. And in the 3rd century AD, when the empire was falling apart, not due to Christians, it was due to other things, there were several pagan emperors who tried to reassert control of the empire through picking a church. And so they picked a religion. One was the Baal cult, one was the Sol Invictus cult, the Invincible Sun cult. So they tried this, but of course every time an emperor did this and picked a church, that this is going to be the church of the empire, they get assassinated, and then someone takes over. So that fails. And what happens is when you get to Constantine, he does the same thing. He just picks a different religion. He picks, randomly pick a religion. I pick Christianity. It might not have been random, but it doesn't matter. He picked Christianity. Others picked others. He didn't get assassinated. He survived for like 30-some years. And so he had all that time to move all the money from the pagan temples into the Christian churches. He had all that time to manipulate the Christian church in terms of its dogma and to establish it as an arm of the empire. And so when his successors took over, they had this fully ramped up system ready to go. It was baked in. There wasn't any way to get rid of it at that point. So it was really just happenstance of who killed who at that point. So Christianity is kind of like just the dice roll eventually turned up snake eyes.
I always thought it shows that because of the cohesiveness and monotheism over polytheism.
I mean, that may have been a factor of it. It may have been a factor that the Christian church spanned both halves of the empire, which was divided at the time, and it did so in a hierarchy that was pretty intact and usable. Maybe. The thing is that we lack is we don't have the correspondence of the other religions. So we don't know what kind of hierarchy was working in Mithraism or ISIS cult or any of this stuff, so we can't really do a direct comparison. So it does look like Christianity had all these things that these others didn't, but only because we don't have the data for those others. We really don't know. So yes, that is actually plausible, and there are a lot of other plausible reasons why he might choose Christianity over the others. Various things he's thinking in his head, like this works better than the others. One obvious one is that Mithraism was the religion of the empire, the army, for a while, and for like 50 years everything was failing. The army's getting annihilated, and you have constant civil wars. You kind of like say, that god obviously sucks, so we need a new one. So one reason is, that's another reason, is like he's trying to get away from these failed gods and trying to pick a new one. And it's very much like Trump voters. So if you're trying to get away from all these failed politicians, we're going to pick a new one. Surely that can't go wrong. It's very similar, I think. The mindset might have been there. So, yeah.
We are not stuck with him for 2,000 years.
And then tomorrow. Immortality drug invented. Trump takes it immediately. Yeah, all right. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, yes. You
You
have.
mentioned many times economy. How did it work in those days? What were the incentives for somebody to be an engineer or scientist?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question.
And if economy tanks, any economists from those days? Any critics?
Not really. They had writers on economics, but they didn't really have economics as a science yet. And in a sense, that's probably why the empire tanked, because they didn't have anyone to tell them that they're doing it wrong. No, it has a very well-developed, sophisticated economy. There used to be a trend in the early 20th century to push the minimalist model, this sort of primitive economic model. Like, our economic system is a totally invention of modernity, and it wasn't there. But tons of archaeological and papyrological and other research has shown lately, so the recent, like the last 20 years of economic historians who are doing ancient studies have shown that the economy was vastly sophisticated, and they had, they really had their own industrial revolution. It was water powered instead of fossil fuel. So they had like water-powered automated sawmills, both for lumber and for stone. They were using water power to automate production of flour, from grain to flour, the grinding grain. They had massive factories that would have 36 water wheels operating simultaneously, moving like 16 stones. There were various different kinds of ways to operate this stuff. So they were automating, and they were aware of this, using water power to sort of upscale their ability to produce things. They had very sophisticated economic models of how to do things. They had the primitive equivalent of insurance, for example. They had the primitive equivalent of corporations. Not quite the same thing as what we mean by a corporation, but had something close. And so they're doing that kind of stuff. It's going on. And one of the things I talk about in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, that one that comes out in December, is I have this section about who these people were, where did they come from. And when we look at the data, it looks, and other historians have pointed this out too, they appear to come from the upper middle class. So they're basically come from families that are that have to work for a living, but they're making a really good living. As opposed to the aristocracy, which just lives off the proceeds of the land and don't have to do shit, right? So they don't have to work at all. They can just sit there like fat cats and have people serve them. The upper middle, and then you have people at the bottom who have to slave just to get by. And then you have people in the middle that have various degrees of surplus they can generate based on their careers. And so Galen is an example. So Galen's the greatest medical scientist of the Roman Empire. His father was an engineer, and his father was an engineer before him. And it sounds like his grandfather was basically just working for the military as an engineer. And of course they need engineers to do all that. For cities, they need engineers to build aqueducts, to plan cities, to build temples, to do all the things they need to do. These water-powered factories needed someone to build them and design them. So there's an economic market for engineering. And there was an incentive if you had a family that had just enough money to send your kids to school, which was expensive. There was no public school. Well, there was some sort of subsidized public schooling, but not to the extent that we have today. If you could get them into engineering, they could get a job and they could start making tons of money building factories, building stuff for the army, building bridges, and so on. And then if they invest well, if they use that, if they don't squander their wealth, they can start investing in land. They might have a little bit of land, and now they've got a little bit of return on the land, and so their kids are even better positioned. Now they can send them to medical school or whatever. And so Galen's father was at the point in this family progression. So his grandfather was just an engineer, like a blue-collar engineer, but earned enough money so that when his son, now Galen's father, he got enough to actually get a little bit of land and actually get some political offices in the fringes of the empire. And so he actually became a big wig, essentially. So he's working up, so upward mobility. And then he was going to make Galen go to school to be an engineer, but a god came and gave him a vision and a dream and said, send him to medical school instead. And so he sent him to medical school. And so Galen got a really top-notch medical school education. And he had a constant stipend. When his dad died, from an inheritance of that little bit of land that he bought, generated some money, but it's just a little bit, like not enough to make you a fat cat, but enough that you didn't have to do anything else. And he lived off of that for his life. And so what you have is you have these families that they're in contact with a work ethic, because you have to work to really accumulate your money, and you have to do something to get the money, but you're succeeding. And then they also have contact with the aristocracy because they're going to their schools, they're hobnobbing with the aristocrats, they're working for them. So they really are the middle ground between the aristocracy and the lower classes. They belong in that middle world, and they can bridge both gaps. They can hang out comfortably with both groups of people and get along with them and understand their culture and stuff. So the scientists are really in the middle. And we see this, all the other scientists for whom we can reconstruct a biography of any kind, it's a similar story again and again and again. When you get to like Archimedes, like he was like a nephew of the king, so he's like in the aristocratic realm. But he was clearly a savant. He's like, might have been autistic. He was just obsessed with the stuff that he did, and it was this massive genius, and they just let him run with it, and he came up with all these amazing things. And here, you read the stories about them, you don't know if the stories about him are true, but they do really have this idea of this person who's so focused on his intellectual life that he's barely aware of political reality and what the point of that is. But he is a patriot and still helps his family defend Syracuse against the Romans and so on with his technology. So the legend goes. But so he might be an exception, but he's still in the family that king is not necessarily an aristocratic family. They come from lower blood and acquired power later. So there's still a connection there with the middle class. So we look at various other scientists, it looks mostly that way. And then the science popularizers tend to be either upper middle class or aristocrats who hobnob with these scientists and say, this is great shit, I should write about this, and they write books, and you get like Seneca, and then you get like Pliny the Elder and things like that, writing these popularizations, these encyclopedias and stuff about science, but they're not the ones doing the science. But they love hanging out with these scientists and talking about this stuff. So yeah, that's the long answer to the question. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And in that realm, is there fiction?
Is there what?
Fiction?
What do you mean?
Are they making up stories?
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah.
So, how do you how do you separate the reality from the fiction?
Sometimes you can't. Some of the best stories about Archimedes are exactly like that. It's like, wow, that's a really great story. It's suspiciously too good. And then others, we have corroborating data. So we have things like, there's a difference between fiction, like a legend about a scientist, and just lying. So, like, we have examples where historians study Galen. Galen's very chatty. He talks about his life and stuff. And a lot of it's just straightforward, hey, this is what happened, this is what I met and did. So it looks like, he's factual, but also he's really trying to promote himself. So you're wondering, like, where are the lies? And so that's a different challenge versus legends about Archimedes, where we don't even know where the story came from. So we do that. But we also have, we have inscriptions. We have a lot of other data we can triangulate to really reconstruct what actually looks reliable. And then, of course, you can compare it against sociological models and anthropological models and see what actually fits what would actually make sense in that context versus what's outrageous and doesn't make sense in that context. It's a complicated business. So, yeah.
But are there any intentionally fictional stories?
Intentionally fictional story. Now,
like today we would write fiction.
Yes. So I have a whole chapter on this, or a big chunk of a chapter in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. The obvious example is comedy, where they're making up stories, jokes. Obviously, they're telling us. So there's a fake history called the Satyricon by Petronius, which is this epic story of this gay man who's desperately on a great religious quest to resurrect his impotent penis, and gets in all these adventures and meets all these people. But the whole thing is a big social commentary on the farce of elite culture and things like that. And he meets some people who tell stories about scientists that are just absurdly false. But the thing is, it's so valuable for us as historians because when you understand the joke, now you understand something about the world, right? So if you get the joke, then you actually get what's real. You know what I mean? So if you know what they're making fun of, you understand the reality of the science. So you can actually learn things about the reality of ancient science and the elite and stuff like that by actually looking at the jokes told about them. And that's an example of that, where fiction can still be useful, even though the stories are false because he's making it up. He's not even pretending to be authentic. And then you have stories where we're not sure, like I mentioned the legends about Archimedes. So do you know the famous one about the bath? So the story is that the king goes to him because he's the genius of the family. He says, hey, I got this fabulous silver and gold crown. I gave the carpenter, I gave the blacksmith or whatever, not blacksmith, whatever, smith. Gave the smith all the gold and silver, and I think he held some back. I don't think it's all in his crown. But I want to melt the crown down and find out, how do I solve this problem? And Archimedes is like, well, that's a good one. I'll work on it. I'll think about it. And then one time he's in the baths, the public baths, and he lowers his body into the bath and watches the water spill over, and it hits him. Like, that's the fucking solution. It's volumes, right? So if I can calculate the volume of displaced water, I can get the volume of any object, no matter how weird it's shaped. And so he, supposedly, according to the story, like, this is brilliant. He jumps out of the bath and runs down the street in public, completely stark naked, yelling, "Eureka, Eureka!" Meaning, I found it, I found it. It's a great story. Is it true?
Story.
Yeah, so that's an example where we just don't know. Fake news, yeah. Yeah. And then we have another story. I'll give you another example. There's this scientist who was also the governor of Greece under the Romans, during the Roman Empire. And he heard about this famous temple that had basically a pickled merman, basically a triton, this sort of like sea creature thing, this fictional sea creature. So he heard they had one. I was like, that's interesting. So as a scientist, he wanted to go see it. And he goes and sees it, and he thinks this is something shady here. Like, this is like P.T. Barnum thing going on here. So it was really like, what is this really? So he like basically breaks into it, takes some of the flesh off, and burns it to try and, from the smell, as a connoisseur of smells, like try to figure out what actual animals are made of. And he, according to the story, he couldn't figure it out. And then, so he's returning from that scientific mission, and there's a ferryman ferrying him across the water, and somehow he accidentally falls out of the ferry and drowns. And then the body is recovered, and then the corpse belches the smell of the triton, and all the locals say, like, there you go, this proves the triton got revenge for him desecrating our god. Now, we actually have other versions of other stories where ferrymen were often hired to assassinate people because that was an ideal location to kill somebody. So what this sounds like really happened is that the locals had him killed, had him knocked off for desecrating their god. But he just wanted to do science on it. And so that shows you the difference between the locals who were very superstitious and anti-science and the elite who were just like, yeah, cut off a piece and burn it, let's figure out what this is. It's a much different approach to reality. So anyway, that's another one. Is that story true? We don't really know. It's a story that was told and was written down. And that's as much as we know. So it does, at least even if it's fiction, it reflects something about the culture and the difference between the elite and the poor. But the reality of it is we don't have any access to as to whether it's a true story.
Fiction today is the same thing.
Often, yeah. It's worse, though, for antiquity. Today we have access to tons of documentation, so we can fact-check things and figure things out, usually. The Roswell case is a classic example of that. In antiquity, almost everything's been destroyed, so we don't have access to the backstory. We can't find them, trace things or any of that, so it makes it much harder.
Did you read The Swerve? If you did, where did you get it?
I did not read The Swerve. I read reviews of it. And yes, I think that actually is a good account of how recovering Epicurean philosophy is a partial factor in driving our recovery of scientific values and reigniting the progress that was going on in antiquity. Even though it wasn't necessary, it was a thing that sort of broke the orthodoxy and started getting people to think, there's other ways to think about the world. And in antiquity, everybody agreed that, yeah, there's tons of ways to think about the world. There's 5 different philosophical schools you can go to. In fact, we recommend you sample them all and assemble your own philosophy out of all of them. Whereas under Christendom, in the Middle Ages, it was no, absolutely don't do that. There's only one church. There's only one way of thinking. And we don't like this idea of different people competing and arguing with each other. There's something fishy about that. It's a very different mindset. But the recovering these lost texts, first it was Aristotle, but then they started recovering Epicurean texts, like Lucretius, for example. Wow, this is very different from Aristotle. And they'd forgotten that. They had forgotten that they were the Aristotelians and the Stoics and the Epicureans and the skeptics would all go together and argue with each other, that this was normal in ancient culture. They'd forgotten about all that. They'd forgotten about Aristotle. It took them hundreds and hundreds of years to recover Aristotle, and they thought that was amazing. Even though Aristotle was the first, he was just, he was like Freud to modern psychology. It's they were unaware of all the advances after Aristotle. And then other texts started showing up, wow, Aristotle wasn't the only one. They're different points of view. That's weird. Different points of view. You can have that. And so that actually, I think, opened people's minds and started getting to think outside the box, and that was really essential to driving the scientific progress.
What was the mindset of the person in power when they were picking those religions, like you mentioned, before Christianity?
Yeah.
Did they do it intentionally? Is there any writing to show that they knew that they used religion as a tool
the short answer is no. Nor would there be, because they're certainly not going to say that, even if it was true. So that's hard to do even today. So reconstructing neocon philosophy today, where it's actually atheistic, but they think that you have to pretend to be religious to trick the public, because the religion is the way to manipulate the public and keep them passive. So this is Strauss, this is the whole Bush administration that had these guys in it. It's very difficult to find them admitting that, because they, by definition, don't want to admit that, because that destroys the purpose of pretending to be religious. And so you have the same problem with the emperors. Not only have we lost tons of documentation, so we don't have access anyway, they probably would never have written it down. So they're not going to admit that that's what they're doing. All you're going to get is their propaganda.
The majority of people wouldn't read it.
Yeah. The point being is that we don't know. So we don't have texts that say that we have to reconstruct it. We have to infer it from circumstantial evidence and things like that. So yeah. Any other questions, or are we good? Well, awesome. I've got some books that helps me pay for my gas money. So thank you. Want to buy anything or have me sign anything? I will. Other than that, I'm going to get another drink. Okay, yeah. And do you want?
Yes.
Speaker back.